All right, get ready, folks, because today we're diving headfirst into one of the most fascinating chapters in history, British expansion in India.
It's a really complex story.
It is. We're talking about how a simple trading company, the East India Company, went from bartering for spices to basically ruling over a massive empire.
Yeah, talk about a corporate takeover.
Right. And to guide our deep dive, we're going to be looking closely at Chapter 5 from A Brief History of Modern India.
A great source for understanding this period.
Absolutely. So, what we're hoping to do is figure out how this incredible transformation happened. What strategies did the British use? What does it tell us about Indian society at the time?
And one of the big questions that always comes up is, did the British set out with this grand plan of conquering India? Or did they just sort of, stumble into an empire?
That's what makes this so fascinating. Was it deliberate or was it, I don't know, a happy accident?
A bit of an accident, yeah. Our source actually delves right into that very debate.
Perfect. Let's unpack that.
So you've got historians like John Seeley, who argue that the British were essentially traitors who got caught up in local politics and rivalries.
And somehow ended up running the show.
Yeah, almost accidentally becoming an empire. But of course, there are other historians who see a much more calculated strategy at play.
A deliberate plan for domination right from the get-go.
Exactly.
So, which is it? Did the British arrive with a blueprint for conquering India, or were they making things up as they went along?
Our source actually suggests it was probably a bit of both. Early on, it seems the East India Company was genuinely focused on trade, but as they gained more power, things started to shift. You see, British politicians and administrators back in England were eyeing India with a more imperialistic lens.
So a shift from let's trade to let's rule.
Exactly. It's really interesting to see how that shift played out.
Okay, so the British go from traders to, let's say, conquerors. But how did they actually pull it off? I mean, India was huge with its own powerful rulers.
Well, a big factor was their military advantage. They had cutting-edge firepower, cannons that could outrange anything the Indians had.
So is a technological mismatch.
In many ways, yes. But it wasn't just about the technology itself. The British also had superior tactics. They were highly disciplined, organized, and strategic in their approach to warfare.
And were the Indian rulers just completely outmatched?
Not necessarily. Many Indian rulers actually recognized the need to modernize their armies.
Oh, interesting. So they saw what was coming and tried to adapt.
Yeah, they started importing European weapons and even hiring European military advisors to try to level the playing field.
Did it work? I mean, was that enough to catch up with the British?
It was a start, but it wasn't enough. You see, they often ended up just copying the European methods without truly understanding the underlying technology and strategy.
So it was like trying to learn a martial art just by watching someone else do it rather than understanding the philosophy behind it.
Exactly. And on top of that, the British had another key advantage. Their officer selection was based on merit. Talent and skill over family connections. This created a much more professional and efficient fighting force.
So they had a more driven, cohesive army. Many Indian armies at the time, were they still kind of operating on a who-you-know system?
A lot of them were,
Mm.
and that meant they often had issues with nepotism, inconsistent pay for their soldiers, which, didn't exactly help with morale or loyalty.
Makes sense. So the British had a more cohesive and driven fighting force. Okay, let's get into some of the actual conflicts now.
Sounds good.
Our source highlights some key battles that really solidified British control, and we're going to start with Bengal.
Bengal was, incredibly wealthy and strategically important, sort of the jewel in the crown of India at the time.
And the British really exploited the situation there.
Oh, yeah. They used existing rivalries and weaknesses within the ruling Nawabs to get a foothold in the region.
The source specifically mentions Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. How did they manage to outmaneuver him?
Well, they were really clever about using their trading privileges as a way to kind of insert themselves into Bengali politics.
So leveraging their economic power for political gain.
Exactly. For example, they fortified Calcutta without his permission, and they even started providing refuge to one of Siraj's political rivals.
Ah, so escalating tensions, stirring the pot a bit.
Exactly. And this eventually led to Siraj attacking and capturing the English fort at Calcutta, which, that led to the whole Black Hole tragedy incident.
Ah, yes, the Black Hole tragedy. That's one of those events that has fueled debate for centuries.
For sure. Historians still argue about its authenticity and the actual number of victims.
Right. But regardless of the specifics, it became a flashpoint, right?
Oh, absolutely. It really inflamed tensions between the British and the Nawab. And then came the Battle of Plassey in 1757,
A turning point.
a huge turning point. And this is where the British, led by Robert Clive, essentially engineered a victory before the battle even began
Hold on, how do you engineer a victory before a battle even starts?
by being incredibly shrewd and manipulative. Clive made secret deals with several of Siraj ud-Dawla's key officials.
Ah, playing both sides against the middle.
Exactly. One of these officials was Mir Jafar, who was promised the position of Nawab if he betrayed Siraj during the battle.
Wow, talk about a high-stakes gamble.
It was, but it paid off. The result was a decisive British victory against a much larger but deeply divided Bengali army.
So the British essentially turned the Nawab's own people against him.
Exactly.
And what happened after Plassey?
Well, they installed Mir Jafar as their puppet Nawab, and in return for putting him in power, he showered the British with rewards, vast sums of money, control over key territories. He even gave them the zamindari of 24 parganas.
Zamindari. For those of us who aren't historians, what does that actually mean?
It's a big deal. It essentially means control over land and, crucially, the right to collect revenue from that land.
So they got the money, the power, the whole package.
Yeah, pretty much. This move gave the British direct control over Bengal's economic heart. And then the 1765 Treaty of Allahabad really solidified this by formally granting them Diwani.
Diwani.
It means the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. So they basically had a stranglehold on the region.
So they'd taken control of the money. From Bengal, the British then turned their attention to another formidable kingdom, right? Mysore. And that's where we encounter a leader who really gave them a run for their money, Hyder Ali.
Hyder Ali is a fascinating figure.
Absolutely. Tell us about him.
Well, he came from really humble beginnings, but he rose to become the ruler of Mysore through sheer brilliance and strategic thinking. He was a skilled military leader, but also a shrewd politician.
What was his approach to dealing with the British?
Well, he recognized the need to modernize his army, so he brought in French expertise to improve his artillery and cavalry. He even embraced new technologies like rocket artillery.
Wow, rockets. He sounds like he was ahead of his time.
He definitely was. And he was a master at playing rival powers against each other. He knew how to exploit the complex political landscape of India to his advantage.
It sounds like he understood the game.
Absolutely. He fought the British in 4 Anglo-Mysore wars, and he inflicted some pretty serious defeats on them along the way.
He wasn't messing around.
Not at all. But ultimately, he faced the same challenge that many Indian rulers did, maintaining consistent alliances. The British were incredibly good at exploiting this. They would constantly try to turn rivals against each other.
Classic divide and conquer.
Exactly. And that's partly what led to Hyder Ali's eventual downfall. But his son, Tipu Sultan, continued the fight.
Ah, yes, Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. He's practically legendary for his resistance against the British.
He was a fierce and charismatic leader who embraced modern weaponry, even sending emissaries to France to keep up with the latest military tech.
You mentioned earlier that his father was into rockets. Did Tipu Sultan continue that trend?
He did. He even had a specialized unit in his army dedicated to rocket warfare.
That's incredible. I mean, this was the 18th century.
Yeah, he was definitely ahead of his time in that regard, and he understood the power of symbolism. He adopted the tiger as his emblem, which, added to his fearsome reputation.
So, a formidable opponent, but even he eventually fell to the British.
He did. They used shifting alliances to isolate him, and he was finally defeated and killed in the 4th Anglo-Mysore War.
A tragic end. But his story really showcases that even with military strength, playing the political game was crucial. At this point, it seems like the British are becoming almost unstoppable.
Their power was definitely growing, but brute force was only part of the equation. They were also developing some pretty sophisticated administrative policies to consolidate their control.
Okay, let's dive into that. What kind of policies are we talking about?
Well, one of the most impactful was the subsidiary alliance system, introduced by Lord Wellesley.
Subsidiary alliance. Sounds friendly enough. What was the catch?
It was very clever, really. On the surface, it seemed like a win-win. Indian rulers would receive British protection from their enemies in exchange for meeting certain conditions.
Reasonable enough. So what were the conditions?
Well, these conditions were designed to slowly chip away at the ruler's independence.
I knew there had to be a catch.
Right. So they had to agree to things like stationing British troops within their territories, paying for the upkeep of those troops, and, here's the kicker, accepting a British resident at their court.
Wait, a resident, like a permanent house guest living in their palace?
Essentially. But more than just a house guest, these residents had a lot of influence. They would advise the rulers on everything from administrative matters to foreign policy.
So basically a subtle way of controlling the ruler's every move.
Exactly. And it was highly effective.
Mhm.
Over time, many Indian rulers became more like puppets, their decisions dictated by the British.
So it was a slow-motion takeover, maintaining the facade of local rule while holding all the real power behind the scenes.
You got it.
And the British managed to impose this system on a lot of Indian states, right?
Oh, yeah. They were very successful. States like Hyderabad, Mysore, Tanjore, Awadh, even the Maratha chiefs.
Wow, they were really expanding their reach. But they weren't done yet, were they? They had another trick up their sleeve, the doctrine of lapse.
Ah, yes, the doctrine of lapse. Now, this was particularly controversial.
It sounds ominous. What was it all about?
Well, it basically exploited a legal loophole. The doctrine stated that if an Indian ruler died without a male heir, his adopted son couldn't inherit the throne.
Really? So what would happen?
The state would be annexed by the British.
Wow, so they were using a technicality to just grab more land?
It was a very clever, if
Yeah.
rather ruthless, way of expanding their territory. They would present it as being in line with Hindu law and custom, but in reality, it was a power grab.
And which British official is most associated with this doctrine?
It's usually associated with Lord Dalhousie, who was a very aggressively expansionist governor general.
And what were the results of this policy? Did it lead to a lot of annexations?
Oh yeah, it led to the annexation of several important states, including Satara, Jhansi, and Nagpur.
And these annexations, I'm assuming, didn't exactly go over well with the Indian population.
They didn't. It fueled a lot of resentment, and of course, it further solidified British control.
So it's clear that the British were playing a long game. They used military might. They were really good at manipulating the political landscape. And they even exploited legal loopholes to build their empire.
Absolutely. And their ambitions didn't stop at India's borders.
Oh, so there's more.
Oh yeah. They were actively engaging with neighboring countries like Bhutan, Nepal, Burma. They even got involved in this great game with Russia for control of Afghanistan.
Hold on, great game. What was that all about?
Well, it's basically a long-running rivalry with Russia over who would have the most influence in Central Asia.
So like a Cold War before the actual Cold War.
That's a great way to put it. And all of these interactions really show just how complex and far-reaching the British Empire had become.
It's incredible to think about how a trading company from a small island nation managed to achieve all
It
this.
really is a remarkable story.
And one that we'll continue to explore in part 2 of our deep dive.
You know, one thing that really stands out about the British, looking back, is just how adaptable they were. They were constantly adjusting their strategies to fit different situations and challenges.
It's true. They had to be flexible, especially when you consider the vast and diverse territory they were dealing with. I mean, different regions, different cultures, different political systems.
Right. And this adaptability was especially evident in their approach to the Northwest frontier. We talked about it a bit earlier, but that region was a constant headache for the British.
Oh, yeah. The Northwest frontier. It was like the Wild West of British India. Rugged terrain, tribal rivalries.
Exactly. And a lot of resistance to outside control. Early on, the British relied heavily on military expeditions, sending in troops to try to punish rebellious tribes and impose their authority.
That seems like it would be pretty costly, both in terms of resources and lives.
It was. And it often backfired. The British eventually realized that a purely military approach just wasn't sustainable in the long run.
So they needed a different strategy.
They did. They started experimenting with different approaches, and one of the key shifts was a move toward forming alliances with tribal leaders.
So instead of trying to conquer them outright, they decided to play the game of tribal politics.
Exactly. They realized that by working with certain tribal leaders, they could gain a degree of influence and control without having to constantly resort to force.
I can see how that would be appealing, but it also seems pretty risky. I mean, weren't they worried about those alliances backfiring?
Of course, it was a delicate balancing act. They had to be very careful about who they chose as allies, and they had to constantly manage those relationships.
So it was a constant game of, figuring out who to trust, who to support, and who to keep at arm's length.
Exactly. And, of course, it didn't always work out perfectly. Tribal loyalties could shift quickly, and even those leaders who collaborated with the British often maintained a certain degree of independence.
So the northwest frontier remained a challenge throughout British rule.
It did. It was a constant source of tension and conflict, requiring a lot of attention and resources from the British administration.
But it seems like they never fully managed to tame it.
No, they didn't. It remained a volatile and unpredictable region. But for now, let's shift our focus back to the heart of India and revisit another key player in this complex story, the Marathas.
Ah, yes, the Marathas. We were talking about them earlier about how the British were slowly chipping away at their power. We left off with the Treaty of Bassein and the Peshwas, let's say, decline.
Right. The Maratha Confederacy was definitely on shaky ground at that point, and the British were ready to take advantage of the situation.
So what happened next? How did the British capitalize on the Marathas' weakness?
Well, even though the Peshwa had essentially become a British puppet, some of the other Maratha chiefs weren't ready to give up without a fight. And that led to the Third Anglo-Maratha War, which lasted from 1817 to 1819.
So a final showdown between the British and the Marathas.
You could say that. And it was a pretty decisive victory for the British.
What happened? Did the Maratha chiefs just crumble under the pressure?
They put up a good fight, but in the end, they just couldn't match the British in terms of military organization and resources.
But that was the end of the Marathas as a major power in India.
It was. The Peshwa's position was abolished, and his territories were absorbed into British India. The Maratha Confederacy was dissolved. It was a pretty sad end for a once powerful empire.
It's a reminder that even great empires can fall, especially when faced with internal divisions and a determined adversary.
Absolutely. And the story of the Marathas also reinforces a pattern we see throughout this period. The British were masters of exploiting existing divisions and using that to their advantage.
Divide and conquer. It seems like that was their go-to strategy.
It was a very effective one. But let's move on to another area where British tactics were particularly controversial, the annexation of Sindh in 1843.
Ah, yes, Sindh. We talked about it a little bit before. Didn't you say that even some British officials at the time found this annexation to be morally questionable?
They did. It was pretty much a straight-up land grab, driven by ambition and strategic considerations rather than any real threat from the rulers of Sindh.
Who are the rulers of Sindh?
They were the Talpura emirs.
Okay. And what was the British justification for taking over? Did they even bother to come up with a reason?
They used some pretty weak excuses, accusing the emirs of being hostile and disloyal to the British. But the real reasons were more about strategic considerations. They saw Sindh as an important territory because of its location and its control of the Indus River.
Ah, the Indus River. That was a vital trade route, wasn't it?
It was, and the British were very keen on controlling it. They also saw Sindh as a potential buffer against Russian influence in the region.
There's that fear of the Russians again.
It was a constant concern for the British.
So they used this combination of fear and manufactured pretexts to justify taking over Sindh. How did they actually go about doing it?
Well, they started by using pressure tactics. They forced the emirs to accept a British resident and allow British troops to be stationed in Sindh, using the First Anglo-Afghan War as an excuse.
The resident strategy again. It seems like every time they wanted to take over a territory, they would start by installing a resident.
It was a very effective way of gradually extending their influence and control. And once those residents were in place, it was only a matter of time before they found a way to justify a full takeover.
And who was the mastermind behind the annexation of Sindh?
The governor-general at the time was Lord Ellenborough, and he was very much in favor of expansion. He saw Sindh as ripe for the taking. So he sent Charles Napier, a British general known for his, let's say, assertive approach to Sindh with instructions to take control.
And how did the emirs respond? Did they just roll over and surrender?
They resisted, of course, but they were simply outmatched by the British forces. Napier's campaign was swift and brutal, and Sindh was annexed in 1843.
Another victory for the British, but this one achieved through tactics that even some British officials found to be, well, dishonorable.
You're right. The annexation of Sindh left a stain on the British reputation. It was a blatant power grab, and it showed that they were willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goals.
Even if it meant sacrificing their principles.
It seems that way.
And this ruthlessness was also evident in their dealings with another formidable power in the region, the Sikhs of Punjab.
Ah, yes, the Sikhs. They were a force to be reckoned with.
They had that legendary Khalsa army, known for its fighting prowess and fierce spirit. This must have been a real challenge for the British.
It was. Under the leadership of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the Sikhs had created a powerful and well-organized state in the early 19th century. Ranjit Singh was a brilliant military leader, but he was also a shrewd politician and diplomat.
What was his strategy for dealing with the British?
Well, he knew that a direct confrontation with the British would be very risky. They were just too powerful. So he chose a path of cautious diplomacy. He tried to maintain a balance of power while also building up his own strength and expanding his territory.
So playing it safe, biding his time, did it work?
It did during his lifetime. He managed to maintain Sikh independence and even earn the respect of the British. But when he died in 1839, things started to unravel.
What happened?
Well, his death created a power vacuum, which led to instability and internal conflicts within the Sikh kingdom. And of course, the British were watching, waiting for an opportunity to exploit the situation.
Always opportunistic.
That's one way to put it. And the opportunity they were waiting for came in 1845, when the First Anglo-Sikh War broke out.
What triggered the war?
There were a number of factors that contributed to the rising tensions. The Sikh army was feeling increasingly threatened by British expansion, and there was a growing sense of national pride and a desire to push back against British encroachment. And then there was a specific incident that sparked the conflict. The Sikh army crossed the Sutlej River,
Which was?
the boundary between Sikh territory and British India.
So that was seen as an act of aggression by the British?
It was, and they used it as a justification to launch a full-scale invasion of Punjab.
And how did the war go?
It was a brutal conflict with heavy losses on both sides. The Sikhs fought bravely, but in the end they were outmatched by the superior firepower and tactics of the British army.
It's a shame. It sounds like they were really up against it.
They were. And their situation was made even worse by internal divisions within the Sikh leadership. Some factions were more willing to cooperate with the British than others, and this undermined their resistance.
That seems to be a recurring theme. The British were so good at exploiting those divisions.
They were masters of it. And in the end, the Sikhs were forced to surrender. The First Anglo-Sikh War ended with the Treaty of Lahore in 1846.
Then what were the terms of the treaty?
The Sikhs had to cede a significant amount of territory to the British. They also had to pay a large indemnity, and they had to accept a British resident at Lahore.
So, a humiliating defeat.
It was. But it wasn't quite the end of the story. The Sikhs were not ready to give up on their independence, and resentment over the terms of the treaty continued to simmer. And that led to the Second Anglo-Sikh War, which broke out just 2 years later in 1848.
So, round two.
Exactly. And this time, the British were determined to crush Sikh resistance once and for all. The fighting was even more brutal than in the First War, but the outcome was the same, a decisive British victory.
And what happened to Punjab after the Second Anglo-Sikh War?
It was formally annexed into British India in 1849.
So another piece of the puzzle falls into place.
That's right. And with the annexation of Punjab, the British had effectively extended their control over most of the Indian subcontinent.
It's really incredible to think about how much they achieved in such a relatively short period of time.
It's a testament to their ambition, their ruthlessness, and their ability to adapt and overcome challenges.
But as we've seen, their expansion came at a high cost, both for the people of India and for their own moral compass.
That's true. And those costs would continue to mount as they grappled with the challenges of governing this vast and diverse empire.
And that's a topic we'll delve into in the next part of our deep dive. It's amazing to think about everything we've uncovered in this deep dive so far. I mean, the British really employed every tactic in the book to build their empire in India.
Yeah, military power, diplomacy, political maneuvering, even exploiting legal loopholes. They were playing chess while others were playing checkers.
Right. And it makes you wonder, what must it have been like to be an Indian ruler during this period, facing this relentless advance of British power?
It must have felt like an unstoppable force. I mean, imagine trying to hold on to your independence when you're constantly being outmaneuvered and outgunned.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about what happened after the conquest. Because the British weren't just conquerors, right? They had to figure out how to actually govern this vast and complex territory.
Exactly. Taking over is one thing, but then you have to figure out how to actually run the place.
So how did they approach that challenge? Did they just impose British laws and customs on everyone?
Not exactly. It was more of a blend. They combined some elements of existing Indian systems with their own British innovations, kind of a hybrid approach.
A hybrid system. That makes sense. So they were adapting to the realities on the ground while still asserting their own authority.
Right. They understood they couldn't just come in and completely overturn everything. They needed to work with existing structures to some extent.
Pragmatic, I guess you could say. What were some of the key features of this new administrative system?
Well, one of the biggest changes was the establishment of a centralized bureaucracy. They brought in a lot of British officials to staff this bureaucracy, and they created a hierarchical system of administration with different departments responsible for things like revenue collection, law enforcement, public works, and so on.
So they imposed their own ideas about bureaucracy and efficiency on India.
To a large degree, yes. But they also recognized that they couldn't do it all themselves. They
Hmm.
still relied on Indian officials, especially at the local level.
So a mix of British oversight and local expertise.
Exactly. They also introduced new legal codes and established a new judicial system.
The goal being to create a uniform legal system across India.
That was the idea. But it was a controversial move, of course. I mean, India already had a long and complex legal tradition with different systems in different regions, and the British often faced accusations of imposing their own values and legal frameworks without really understanding the local context.
I can imagine that didn't go over too well in some quarters. So this new administrative system, it sounds like it had its pros and cons.
It did. On the one hand, it brought a degree of order and efficiency to the administration. But on the other hand, it was often seen as being insensitive to local traditions and customs.
And it was designed to serve British interests first and foremost, right?
That's a point of contention among historians. I mean, some argue that the British were primarily concerned with exploiting India for their own economic gain. And there's no question that they implemented policies that benefited British industries and trade. For example, they encouraged the production of cash crops like cotton and indigo, which were then exported to Britain.
So India essentially became a supplier of raw materials for the British Empire.
In many ways, yes. And they also discouraged the development of local industries in India that might compete with British manufacturing.
That doesn't sound very fair.
It wasn't. But it's important to note that there's also a lot of debate about the actual economic impact of British rule. Some historians argue that it led to the decline of traditional Indian industries and caused widespread poverty. Others say that the British also introduced some positive changes, like building railroads and irrigation systems, which had some benefits for the Indian economy.
It sounds like a complicated issue.
It is. And it's a reminder that the effects of British rule were complex and varied. Different regions and different groups of people experienced it in different ways.
That's an important point. It's too easy to oversimplify history and just say that everything was good or everything was bad. It's much more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. And, it's important to remember that we're still grappling with the legacy of British rule in India today. The effects of colonialism continue to shape Indian society and politics in profound ways.
Well, that's a thought-provoking note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the motivations behind British expansion in India, the strategies they used to build their empire, and the administrative systems they put in place to govern this vast and diverse land.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, and it's a reminder that history is never simple. It's full of complexities, contradictions, and unintended consequences. And it's something we can learn from even today. So thanks to everyone for joining us on this exploration of British expansion in India. It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you.
It's been a pleasure.